Welcome to another exploration into the darker corners of American history, stories that remain as mysterious as they are unsettling. Before we begin, take a moment to let us know in the comments where you're watching from and what time of day or night this narration has reached you. The year was 1862. Deep in the Missouri Ozarks, where mist clings to ancient hills and secrets rot beneath the soil, something happened that was never meant to be remembered. Something so brutal, so deliberately erased from the pages of history that even today, mentioning it feels like disturbing a grave. In the dusty archives of Missouri's State Historical Society, you'll find detailed accounts of every major Civil War battle fought on Missouri soil. Wilson's Creek, Lexington, Pilot Knob. Each tragedy meticulously documented, preserved for posterity. But search for the Crenshaw Clan Massacre of 1862, and you'll find nothing, not even a whisper, not even a footnote. This isn't an oversight. This is intentional silence. When historians attempted to research Civil War atrocities in the Ozarks during the 1930s, they discovered something chilling. References to the Crenshaw family simply vanished. Court records with pages torn out. Newspaper archives with suspicious gaps. Even cemetery records that should have documented the burials were mysteriously absent. What kind of horror was so unspeakable that an entire community conspired to erase it from memory? What happened in those remote Missouri hills that was deemed too dangerous for future generations to know? The answer lies buried in the blood-soaked soil of the Current River Valley, where on a cold March night in 1862 an entire family was wiped from existence, and then wiped from history itself. But the dead don't stay buried forever, and some stories refuse to die, no matter how deeply they're planted in forgotten ground. To understand the nightmare that befell the Crenshaw clan, we must first step into the hellscape that was Missouri during the Civil War. This wasn't the romanticized battlefield warfare of Gettysburg or Bull Run. This was something far more savage. Something that turned neighbor against neighbor, brother against brother, in a landscape where trust died first. The Missouri Ozarks in 1862 existed in a state of perpetual terror. These weren't the gentle, rolling hills tourists visit today. These were lawless mountains where death came swift and without warning, where families barricaded themselves behind shuttered windows each night, never knowing if they'd see another dawn. Confederate guerrillas, known as bushwhackers, moved like ghosts through the dense forests. Led by men like William Clark Quantrill, they struck without mercy, then melted back into the wilderness before Union forces could respond. But the Union wasn't innocent either. Federal troops, frustrated by an enemy they couldn't catch, often took their rage out on suspected Confederate sympathizers, whether they had proof or not. This was the era of the Jayhawkers, the Red Legs, and the Kansas-Missouri border wars that had been raging since the 1850s. By 1862, the violence had reached a fever pitch. Entire communities lived under martial law. Loyalty oaths were demanded at gunpoint. A wrong word, a suspicious glance, could mark you for death. In this atmosphere of paranoia and bloodshed, isolated farm families became easy targets. Cut off from the protection of towns, dependent on neighbors who might turn informant at any moment, they faced impossible choices. Support the Union and risk Confederate retaliation. Support the Confederacy and face federal wrath. Remain neutral and be suspected by both sides. The Ozark Mountains themselves seemed to encourage violence. The thick forests provided perfect cover for ambushes. The winding valleys concealed movements. The isolated homestead stood vulnerable, too far from help to survive a determined attack. And in this landscape of fear, the Crenshaw family had made themselves a target. News traveled slowly in those days, but when it did arrive, it brought fresh horrors. In August 1862, Confederate guerrillas would massacre over 150 civilians in Lawrence, Kansas. But even before that infamous raid, smaller atrocities were occurring almost weekly throughout Missouri. Families found murdered in their beds, homesteads burned to ash, wells poisoned with corpses. The federal response was often just as brutal. General Thomas Ewing would later issue Order No. 11, forcing the evacuation of entire counties suspected of harboring Confederate sympathizers. But even in early 1862, Union forces were conducting their own campaigns of terror, convinced that harsh measures were the only way to crush the rebellion. In this nightmare landscape, the Crenshaw family was about to discover that in war, innocence is no protection. And in the Missouri Ozarks of 1862, mercy was a luxury no one could afford. The Crenshaw name first appears in Missouri land records in the 1840s, when Ezekiel Crenshaw purchased 480 acres along the current river in what would become Shannon County. He was a man seeking the American dream in its purest form: land, independence, and the right to live free from interference. What he found instead was a legacy written in blood. Ezekiel built more than just a farm. His homestead resembled a fortress, with thick log walls and strategically placed windows that could serve as gun ports if needed. This wasn't paranoia, it was survival. The Ozarks attracted men running from something, whether it was the law, creditors, or a past. They preferred to forget. Trust was earned at gunpoint, and even then it could evaporate overnight. By 1860, 3 generations of Crenshaws had put down roots along the current river. Ezekiel's sons, Samuel, Joshua, and Micah, had built their own cabins within sight of the original homestead. Their children played in the same creek where their fathers had learned to fish. Their wives tended gardens planted with seeds brought from Tennessee. To an outsider, it might have seemed like a peaceful family compound. To their neighbors, it looked like something else entirely. The problem wasn't what the Crenshaws did. It was what people believed they did. Rumors spread like wildfire through the isolated communities of the Ozarks. Some claimed Samuel Crenshaw had been seen talking to Confederate recruiters in nearby Salem. Others swore they'd witnessed Joshua providing food to a group of bushwhackers moving through the area. Micah, the youngest brother, was accused of hiding weapons intended for Confederate forces. But there were counter-rumors, too. Union sympathizers whispered that Ezekiel's grandson Thomas had secretly guided federal patrols through treacherous mountain passes. A local school teacher claimed she'd seen Crenshaw women tending to wounded Union soldiers. Each story contradicted the others, but in the paranoid atmosphere of wartime Missouri, contradiction didn't matter. Suspicion was enough. The truth was probably simpler and more human than any of the rumors. The Crenshaws, like most Ozark families, were likely trying to survive by helping whoever showed up at their door with the most guns. In a region where allegiances shifted with the wind, flexibility was a survival skill. Unfortunately, it was also a death sentence. The family's isolation worked against them. Their nearest neighbor lived 3 miles away, close enough to spread rumors, far enough to avoid getting involved when trouble came calling. The Crenshaw compound sat in a natural bowl surrounded by ridges, providing privacy but also making escape nearly impossible. They'd chosen their location for defensibility, but they'd also chosen a perfect trap. Local church records from the period show the family attended services irregularly, another mark against them in a community where religious devotion was often seen as proof of loyalty. The Crenshaws kept to themselves, minded their own business, and asked nothing from their neighbors. In peacetime, these would have been virtues. In 1862, Missouri, they were signs of guilt. As winter turned to spring, the whispers grew louder. Someone claimed to have seen smoke signals from the Crenshaw land. Another reported strange lights moving through their woods at night. A local merchant said the family had purchased an unusual amount of supplies, enough to feed more people than lived in their household. The truth behind these reports will never be known. What matters is that by March 1862, the Crenshaw family had been tried and convicted in the court of public opinion. Their sentence was already decided. All that remained was the execution. And in the Missouri Ozarks, executions didn't require judges or juries. They only required darkness, and men willing to do what others whispered should be done. As 1862 progressed, the violence in Missouri reached levels that shocked even hardened veterans of the Kansas border wars. This wasn't military conflict anymore. It was neighbor warfare, brother against brother butchery that left entire communities scarred for generations. The federal government's response to Missouri's guerrilla problem was creating more problems than it solved. Union commanders, frustrated by an enemy that refused to fight conventional battles, began treating all rural civilians as potential enemies. Loyalty oaths became mandatory, but signing one only made you a target for Confederate sympathizers. Refusing to sign made you a target for federal forces. General Henry Halleck's harsh policies in Missouri included the arrest of civilian hostages, property confiscation, and the execution of captured guerrillas without trial. These measures were designed to crush Confederate resistance, but they often pushed neutral families toward the very rebellion they were meant to prevent. The Crenshaw family found themselves caught in this impossible situation. Their remote location meant they had little choice but to deal with whoever controlled their area at any given moment. Confederate bushwhackers might demand food and shelter 1 week. Federal patrols might require information and supplies the next. Refusing either could be fatal. Local militia units, supposedly loyal to the Union, were often more dangerous than actual Confederate forces. These were men who knew the area intimately, who had personal grudges to settle under the cover of patriotic duty. They operated with minimal oversight, answerable to distant commanders who cared more about results than methods. The enrolled Missouri militia, established in 1862, was particularly brutal in its operations. Composed largely of men whose families had been targeted by Confederate guerrillas, they showed no mercy to suspected Southern sympathizers. Their definition of suspected was broad enough to include anyone who looked at them wrong. In Shannon County, where the Crenshaws lived, the situation was especially volatile. The county straddled the line between Union-controlled territory and Confederate strongholds. Military control changed hands regularly, leaving civilians to navigate an ever-shifting landscape of loyalties and threats. Reports from the period describe a community paralyzed by fear. Families abandoned their homes and fled to Union-controlled towns, only to find themselves viewed with suspicion there too. Those who stayed faced constant visits from both sides, each demanding proof of loyalty while threatening death for collaboration with the enemy. The psychological toll was enormous. Children grew up expecting violence as a normal part of life. Women learned to hide valuables and prepare escape routes. Men slept with loaded weapons and made peace with the possibility that each dawn might be their last. In this atmosphere, accusations didn't require evidence. A grudge over a land dispute could become a charge of treason. A business disagreement could be reframed as enemy collaboration. Personal vendettas wore the mask of patriotic duty, and murder masqueraded as military necessity. The Crenshaw family, with their isolated homestead and divided reputation, had become a focal point for all the community's fears and suspicions. Some saw them as dangerous Confederate sympathizers who needed to be eliminated. Others viewed them as innocent victims of wartime hysteria. But as spring approached, the voices calling for action were growing louder than those urging restraint. The stage was set for tragedy. All that was needed was a spark to ignite the powder keg of accumulated hatred and fear. That spark was about to come from an unexpected source, and when it did, the resulting explosion would consume not just the Crenshaw family, but the very memory of what was about to unfold. The night of March 23rd, 1862, arrived with an unseasonable chill that seemed to seep into men's bones and freeze their hearts. A new moon left the Missouri Ozarks in absolute darkness, broken only by the occasional flicker of oil lamps in distant windows. It was the kind of night when decent people barred their doors and prayed for dawn. It was the perfect night for murder. Sarah Crenshaw was the first to hear them coming. She'd always been a light sleeper, a trait that had served her well during these troubled times. The sound that woke her wasn't the usual night noise of the Ozark wilderness, not the hoot of an owl or the rustle of deer moving through the underbrush. This was the deliberate crunch of boots on frozen ground, the muffled jingle of metal, the whispered commands of men who thought they moved in silence. She shook her husband Joshua awake, her hand pressed firmly over his mouth to prevent any sound. In the darkness of their cabin, she could see his eyes go wide with understanding. They both knew what night sounds like this meant. They'd heard the stories from other settlements, other families who had awakened to find their homes surrounded by shadows with guns. Through the chinks in their log walls, they could see them now. Dark shapes moving like wolves through the trees. Torches flickered to life one by one, creating a ring of fire around the Crenshaw compound. Sarah counted at least 20 men, maybe more. Too many to fight. Too many to escape. The leader stepped forward into the torchlight, and Joshua felt his blood turn to ice. It was Marcus Webb, a man he'd known since childhood, someone he'd helped bring in harvest just 2 years before. Webb's face was set in hard lines, his eyes reflecting the flame like a predator's. When he spoke, his voice carried clearly across the cold air. "Crenshaws, come out now, and we'll make this quick. Stay inside, and we'll burn you out first." The ultimatum hung in the air like smoke. In the main cabin, old Ezekiel Crenshaw was already moving, his arthritic hands steady as he loaded his rifle. At 73, he'd lived through Indian raids, border wars, and the chaos of westward expansion. He'd always known his life might end in violence. He just hadn't expected it to come from his neighbors. Samuel Crenshaw's cabin was already under attack. Sarah could hear the splintering of wood as axes bit into his door, the screams of his wife and children inside. The sound cut through her like a blade, because she knew, they all knew, that Samuel wasn't even home. He'd ridden to Springfield 3 days ago on business, leaving his family defenseless. The massacre began with systematic brutality. Webb's men weren't random vigilantes acting in passion. They moved with military precision, cutting off escape routes, coordinating their attacks, ensuring no one could flee into the woods. These were neighbors, men who knew every trail, every hiding spot, every weakness of the Crenshaw homestead. Joshua tried to make a run for it, bursting from his cabin with his rifle blazing. He managed to drop one attacker before a volley of shots cut him down in his own dooryard. Sarah's scream echoed across the valley as she watched her husband fall, his blood steaming in the cold air. The horror escalated beyond anything the bushwhacker raids had produced. These weren't soldiers following orders or guerrillas pursuing military objectives. These were men who had worked themselves into a righteous fury, Convinced they were purging their community of traitors and spies, they showed no mercy to age or innocence. Ezekiel made his last stand from his cabin window, his ancient hunting rifle speaking defiance into the night. But at his age, reloading was slow, and there were too many targets. When the flames finally drove him out, he faced his killers with the dignity of a man who had nothing left to lose. They cut him down without ceremony, his body falling across the threshold he had crossed for 20 years. The children's screams were the worst part. Even men hardened by years of violence found themselves shaken by the sounds coming from Samuel's cabin. But they had come too far to turn back now, and in their twisted logic, leaving witnesses would only invite retaliation. The children had seen their faces. The children would have to die. By dawn, 17 members of the Crenshaw family lay dead. Men, women, children, even the family dogs. Nothing that could tell the tale was left alive. The killers worked by torchlight, dragging bodies into the main cabin before setting it ablaze. They wanted the evidence destroyed, the story erased, the very memory of the Crenshaws consumed by fire. But fires in log cabins don't burn as completely as men hope. When the flames died down, charred bones remained scattered in the ashes, teeth that could be identified, wedding rings that had survived the heat, evidence that would have to be dealt with more thoroughly. As the sun rose over the Current River Valley, 23 men stood looking at what they had done. Some wept, others vomited. A few simply stared in shock at the magnitude of their crime. But all of them understood that they now shared a secret that would bind them together for the rest of their lives. Marcus Webb gathered his men around him one last time. The words he spoke that morning would echo through the community for decades. What happened here tonight never happened. The Crenshaws moved west. Anyone who says different is calling us all murderers, and we know what happens to people who make accusations they can't prove. The conspiracy of silence began before the ashes were cold, and it would endure long after the last of the killers had joined their victims in the grave. In the days following the massacre, something extraordinary happened in Shannon County. Absolutely nothing. No investigation was launched, no questions were asked, no official report was filed. It was as if the Crenshaw family had simply evaporated into the Missouri morning mist. But secrets have a way of eating at men's souls, and witnesses have a way of surviving even the most thorough attempts at elimination. Hidden in the root cellar of Samuel Crenshaw's cabin, 11-year-old Mary Crenshaw had heard everything. She had listened to her family die above her head, had smelled the smoke as their home became their funeral pyre, had waited in absolute silence as the killers searched for survivors. Mary remained hidden for 2 days, surviving on stored potatoes and creek water, before finally emerging into a world that no longer contained anyone she loved. What she saw in the ruins of her family's compound would haunt her for the rest of her life, and her testimony would haunt Shannon County for generations. She stumbled to the nearest neighbor's house, 3 miles through trackless forest, arriving at the Hendricks farm like a ghost made flesh. Emma Hendricks later described the child as more dead than alive, her eyes holding horrors no child should ever see. But when Mary tried to tell her story, she found that no one wanted to hear it. The Hendricks family was kind, but terrified. They fed Mary, cleaned her wounds, and gave her shelter. But they also made it clear that speaking about what she had witnessed would only bring the same fate upon their family. Some stories, Emma Hendricks told the child, are too dangerous to tell. Mary was passed quietly from family to family, each household keeping her for a few weeks before finding reasons to send her elsewhere. She became a living reminder of what could happen to those who attracted the wrong kind of attention. By summer, she had been sent east to relatives in St. Louis, effectively exiled from the only home she had ever known. But even in St. Louis, Mary's story found no official ears willing to listen. The city was dealing with its own Confederate sympathizers and Union loyalists, its own problems of divided loyalty and violent retribution. A massacre in the remote Ozarks seemed less important than the battles being fought closer to home. The few neighbors who had heard rumors about the Crenshaw family's fate learned to speak in whispers and half-sentences. That family that used to live on the current river heard they moved west. Lucky they got out when they did. The fiction became accepted truth through repetition, and the truth became a ghost story told in hushed tones. Local minister Reverend Isaiah Blackwood attempted to conduct a proper investigation in the summer of 1862, but he found doors closed and mouths sealed wherever he went. Church members who had always been eager to share gossip suddenly claimed to know nothing about their former neighbors. When Blackwood pressed the issue, he received a midnight visit from men who made it clear that some subjects were not appropriate for pulpit discussion. The Reverend's journal, discovered years later, contained a telling entry. "I have witnessed a community's soul die. Good Christian people have chosen silence over justice, and in doing so, they have become accomplices to evil. I fear this sin will poison our land for generations to come." Even the physical evidence was systematically destroyed. The burned remains of the Crenshaw compound were buried under tons of dirt and rock, creating what looked like a natural hillside. Visitors to the area today would never guess that 17 people died there, that their bones still rest beneath the innocent-looking mound covered with native grass and wildflowers. The land itself seemed cursed by the secret it contained. Successive owners reported crop failures, sick livestock, and an overwhelming sense of unease that drove most away within a year or two. By the 1870s, the property had been abandoned, reverting to wilderness, as if nature itself rejected the stain of what had occurred there. Mary Crenshaw lived to be 87 years old, but she never returned to Missouri. In her final years, living in a St. Louis nursing home, she would sometimes speak to the nurses about her family's fate. But by then, she was considered a confused old woman sharing delusions about events that officially never happened. Her death certificate, filed in 1938, listed no next of kin. She was buried in a pauper's grave, the last of the Crenshaws taking their story to the grave with her. Or so it seemed. But Mary had written everything down. Hidden in her modest belongings was a detailed account of that March night in 1862, complete with names, descriptions, and a child's unflinching memory of horror. The document would remain undiscovered for another 40 years, a time bomb of truth waiting to explode the conspiracy of silence that had protected the killers for so long. When that document finally surfaced, it would explain why the Crenshaw massacre had been so thoroughly erased from Missouri's historical record. The truth, it turned out, was too dangerous for anyone to tell, until everyone responsible for keeping the secret was safely dead and buried. By the time the Civil War ended in 1865, the conspiracy of silence surrounding the Crenshaw massacre had become a way of life in Shannon County. What had begun as a desperate attempt to avoid prosecution had evolved into something more insidious, a collective agreement to rewrite history itself. The cover-up operated on multiple levels, from the most local institutions to the highest corridors of power in Missouri's state government. County clerks learned to lose documents that might reference the Crenshaw family. Courthouse fires, surprisingly common in post-war Missouri, consumed records that might have contained inconvenient truths. Maps were redrawn to eliminate references to Crenshaw holdings, and land records were quietly amended to show the property as unclaimed federal territory. Federal authorities, dealing with the massive task of reconstruction, had little interest in investigating rural Missouri massacres that might implicate Union sympathizers. The official narrative required clear distinctions between loyal Americans and Confederate traitors. Stories that complicated that narrative, stories of loyal citizens murdering their neighbors in patriotic frenzy, were actively suppressed. The Missouri State Historical Society, established to preserve the state's Civil War legacy, received numerous accounts of guerrilla warfare and civilian atrocities. But reports mentioning the Crenshaw family were consistently lost or misfiled. Researchers who inquired about gaps in the historical record were told that many documents had been damaged by floods or fires, standard explanations that effectively ended most inquiries. Newspaper editors throughout Missouri received subtle pressure to avoid certain topics. Publishers who relied on local advertising learned that some stories could make their businesses unwelcome in their communities. The Springfield Republican, which had initially planned to investigate reports of civilian massacres in the Ozarks, quietly dropped the project after several major advertisers threatened to withdraw their support. Even academic historians found their research constrained by invisible boundaries. Professor William Steele of Missouri State University attempted to compile a comprehensive record of Civil War atrocities in the state during the 1890s, but his work was repeatedly blocked by administrative concerns. His notes, stored in the university archives, show increasing frustration with sources who refused to speak and documents that mysteriously vanished. The Catholic Church, which administered to many Ozark families, maintained its own silence. Parish records that should have documented the deaths of 17 people showed no deaths at all for the Crenshaw family. When questioned about the discrepancy, church officials claimed the family had relocated to California before the war's end, a story that became the official explanation for their disappearance. Legal records present the most telling evidence of the cover-up's scope. Property deeds that should have shown the transfer of Crenshaw land after their deaths instead show the property as escheated to the county due to abandonment. No probate proceedings were ever initiated. No death certificates were filed. In the eyes of Missouri law, the Crenshaw family had simply ceased to exist. The conspiracy's success depended on a shared understanding among the participants that their crime was too serious to ever acknowledge. Unlike many Civil War atrocities, which were later rationalized as military necessities, the Crenshaw massacre could not be explained away. It was cold-blooded murder of civilians, including children, committed by neighbors rather than enemy soldiers. Several of the participants attempted to confess their involvement in later years, driven by guilt or religious conviction. But their confessions were dismissed as the ravings of disturbed individuals, fabrications designed to attract attention or settle old scores. The community had invested too much in the cover-up to allow individual consciences to undermine it. The most chilling aspect of the cover-up was how it transformed the participants from murderers into guardians of community virtue. Marcus Webb, the massacre's leader, became a respected businessman and civic leader. He served on the county school board and was instrumental in establishing Shannon County's first official library. His obituary in 1897 praised him as one of our community's most devoted patriots and moral exemplars. Other participants parlayed their shared secret into political and economic power. They formed business partnerships, arranged marriages between their children, and created a network of mutual protection that dominated Shannon County politics for decades. Their guilt became their bond, and their crime became the foundation of their prosperity. The success of the cover-up created a template that would be used to conceal other atrocities throughout the American frontier. Communities learned that with sufficient coordination and determination, even the most heinous crimes could be erased from official memory. All it required was the collective will to deny that certain events had ever occurred. But memory, unlike official records, cannot be entirely controlled. And in the Missouri Ozarks, where oral tradition runs as deep as the spring-fed rivers, some stories refuse to die, no matter how thoroughly they're buried in official silence. As the 19th century drew to a close, the official silence surrounding the Crenshaw massacre began to crack under the weight of accumulated guilt and supernatural terror. What had been successfully hidden from historical record could not be erased from the land itself, and the Missouri Ozarks began to whisper tales that chilled even the hardiest mountain folk. The first reports came from hunters and trappers who ventured into the area where the Crenshaw homestead had once stood. They spoke of hearing children's laughter echoing through the forest, where no children lived, of seeing lights flickering in the ruins of cabins that had been burned to ash decades earlier. Most unsettling were the reports of voices calling for help, voices that seemed to come from beneath the ground itself. Local farmers began to avoid the area entirely after several disturbing incidents. Livestock refused to graze on the land where the Crenshaw compound had stood, becoming agitated and sometimes violent when forced near the site. Hunting dogs would stop dead in their tracks at the property line, whimpering and backing away as if confronting some invisible threat. The psychological toll on the surviving participants in the massacre was becoming increasingly apparent. Marcus Webb, the man who had led the attack, began suffering from what his family called night terrors. He would wake screaming about children's voices, claiming they were calling his name and demanding justice. His wife found him several times standing in his yard in the middle of the night, staring in the direction of the old Crenshaw land. Other members of the group experienced similar afflictions. Thomas Garrett, who had participated in the killing of the children, developed a tremor in his hands that prevented him from working. He told his doctor that he constantly felt small fingers tugging at his clothes, but when he looked down, nothing was there. James Morrison began drinking heavily and was frequently heard muttering apologies to people who weren't present. The community's attempts to rationalize these phenomena only made them more terrifying. Some claimed the men were suffering from war-related ailments, a common enough occurrence among Civil War veterans. Others suggest that guilt over wartime actions was manifesting in disturbed sleep and nervous conditions. But the specificity of the symptoms, the consistent references to children's voices and phantom touches, suggested something more targeted and deliberate. Folk remedies and protective measures began appearing throughout Shannon County. Salt lines were drawn around property boundaries. Iron horseshoes were nailed above doorways. Families began hanging mirrors outside their homes, believing that spirits could be confused by their own reflections. These practices, borrowed from older superstitions, took on new urgency as reports of supernatural activity increased. The local Methodist Church experienced a dramatic increase in attendance as community members sought spiritual protection from forces they couldn't name. Reverend Samuel Hayes, who had replaced the questioning Isaiah Blackwood, found himself conducting impromptu exorcisms and blessing ceremonies for families who claimed their homes were being visited by restless spirits. But the most chilling reports came from children. Young people who had no knowledge of the massacre began having similar nightmares about a family that lived by the river, about men with torches surrounding a cabin, about voices calling for help that no one would answer. Some children claimed to have invisible playmates who told them sad stories about being hurt by bad men who were never punished. These childhood reports terrified adults who recognized details that should have been impossible for the children to know. When 7-year-old Annie Webb, Marcus Webb's own granddaughter, began describing a girl named Mary who lived in a root cellar and watched her family die, Webb himself nearly collapsed from shock. How could the child know about Mary Crenshaw when her existence had been systematically erased from all records? The supernatural activity reached its peak during the 1890s, as many of the massacre participants reached old age. Death seemed to intensify rather than diminish the phenomena. When Marcus Webb died in 1897, his funeral was disrupted by what witnesses described as the sound of children singing hymns in harmonious voices that seemed to come from the sky itself. Subsequent deaths of massacre participants were marked by similar occurrences. Strange lights appeared over their graves. Mourners reported feeling small hands touching them during funeral services. Several widows claimed their deceased husbands visited them to confess their participation in something terrible that happened during the war. The community's response was to double down on the cover-up, treating the supernatural reports as extensions of the historical silence. People who claimed to witness paranormal activity were discouraged from discussing it publicly. Families who reported hauntings were quietly encouraged to move away from the area. Children who had disturbing dreams were told they had overactive imaginations and were forbidden from repeating their stories. But the land itself seemed determined to preserve the memory that human institutions had worked so hard to erase. Archaeological surveys conducted in the early 1900s revealed anomalies in the soil composition around the former Crenshaw property. Chemical signatures consistent with large quantities of burned organic matter and scattered bone fragments. Geological studies showed that the area had been disturbed far more extensively than would be expected from normal farming or logging activities. The pattern of disturbance suggested systematic attempts to bury evidence, to level the ground, and to obscure the original contours of the homestead site. By the turn of the century, the Crenshaw Massacre had achieved a unique status in American folklore, a ghost story that was simultaneously everywhere and nowhere, known by everyone and acknowledged by no one. It had become the perfect supernatural tale, rooted in truth, protected by silence, and sustained by the very efforts made to destroy it. The spirits of the Missouri Ozarks, it seemed, were less willing to forget than the living residents of Shannon County. And as a new century dawned, those spirits were about to find an unexpected ally in their quest for justice and remembrance. The dawn of the 20th century brought new challenges to maintaining the conspiracy of silence that had protected the perpetrators of the Crenshaw Massacre for nearly 4 decades. Modern communication, professional journalism, and academic historical research all posed threats to the carefully constructed fiction that had erased the family's existence from official memory. The first serious challenge came from an unexpected source: the Federal Writers Project, launched during the Great Depression as part of Roosevelt's Works Progress Administration. WPA researchers were tasked with collecting oral histories from elderly Americans, preserving stories that might otherwise be lost with the passing of the Civil War generation. In Missouri, these interviews began uncovering fragments of stories that officials had thought were safely buried. Interviewer Margaret Stone was working in Shannon County in 1936 when she encountered 82-year-old Josephine Garrett, widow of Thomas Garrett, one of the men who had participated in the massacre. Josephine, suffering from dementia and unaware of the family's long-standing vow of silence, began telling stories about her late husband's nightmares and his repeated references to the children by the river. Stone's interview notes, preserved in the Library of Congress, contained tantalizing fragments. Subject repeatedly mentioned husband's distress about what we'd done to those young ones, and his belief that they come back to visit him every night. When pressed for details, Subject became agitated and claimed, "Tom said we ain't supposed to talk about the River family, but they won't let him rest." Similar fragments emerged from other interviews throughout the Ozarks region. Elderly residents spoke in coded language about the family that went away sudden-like and that trouble during the war that we don't discuss. Most WPA workers dismissed these references as the confused memories of old people, but a few began to suspect they were uncovering evidence of a deliberately suppressed historical event. Professional historians also began asking uncomfortable questions. Dr. Elizabeth Warren of the University of Missouri was researching civilian casualties during the Civil War when she noticed significant gaps in Shannon County records. Her 1934 paper, Lacunae in Missouri Civil War Documentation, noted that entire families appear to have vanished from census records between 1860 and 1870, with no corresponding documentation of relocation, military service, or mortality. Warren's research was limited by the same institutional resistance that had stymied earlier investigators, but she managed to identify several families whose disappearance could not be adequately explained by existing documentation. The Crenshaws were among them, listed as a representative example of systematic record gaps that suggest deliberate historical suppression. The most significant breakthrough came from an unlikely source: the Daughters of the American Revolution. In 1938, the DAR was conducting genealogical research to identify descendants of Revolutionary War veterans when they encountered the Mary Crenshaw mystery. Mary had been found living in a St. Louis nursing home, claiming to be the sole survivor of a family massacred during the Civil War. DAR researcher Helen Morrison initially dismissed Mary's story as the delusions of an elderly woman seeking attention. But when Mary provided specific details about her family's Revolutionary War service, details that could be verified through military records, Morrison began to take her claims more seriously. Mary's account of her family's massacre was detailed, consistent, and included information that could be checked against surviving records. Morrison's investigation revealed that the Crenshaw family had indeed existed, that they had owned property in Shannon County, and that they had completely disappeared from all records after 1862. When Morrison attempted to research what had happened to them, she encountered the same wall of silence that had protected the truth for 76 years. The DAR investigation might have been just another frustrated attempt to uncover the truth, except for one crucial development. Mary Crenshaw died in December 1938, and among her possessions was a detailed written account of the massacre. The document, written in a careful schoolgirl's hand, provided names, dates, and descriptions that transformed the mystery from speculation into documented historical fact. Mary's manuscript, titled "What Happened to My Family," began with a child's straightforward declaration: "I am writing this down so somebody will know the truth about how my family died. I was 11 years old when the bad men came, and I saw everything from where I was hiding in the root cellar." The document proceeded to detail the events of March 23, 1862, with the clarity of traumatic memory and the specificity of an eyewitness account. Mary had recorded not just what happened, but who did it, providing a complete list of the men who had participated in the massacre, including their leadership roles and specific actions during the attack. Morrison found herself in possession of evidence that could destroy the reputations of some of Missouri's most prominent pioneer families. Many of the men Mary had named were remembered as civic leaders and war heroes. Their descendants held positions of influence throughout the state. The truth about the Crenshaw massacre would not just rewrite local history, it would shatter carefully constructed family legacies. The DAR faced an unprecedented dilemma. Their organization was dedicated to preserving American history and honoring the memory of those who had served their country. But the history they had uncovered was so inflammatory, so destructive to established narratives, that publishing it might do more harm than good. The massacre had been hidden for good reason. Revealing it now would only create new pain and controversy. After months of internal debate, the DAR chose a compromise solution that satisfied no one but preserved their institutional reputation. They deposited Mary's manuscript in a restricted archive, available only to qualified researchers with legitimate academic purposes. The document would be preserved for future generations, but it would not be publicized or actively promoted. This decision meant that the truth about the Crenshaw massacre remained buried for another 3 decades, known only to a handful of scholars and archivists who lacked the resources or institutional support to bring it to public attention. The conspiracy of silence had evolved into a conspiracy of academic caution, just as effective at suppressing the truth as the original cover-up had been. But preserving Mary's manuscript, even in restricted archives, had broken the seal on the secret. For the first time since 1862, the truth existed in documented form, waiting for the right researcher, the right moment, and the right combination of circumstances to finally bring the Crenshaw massacre into the light of historical scrutiny. That moment would come, but not for many years. And when it did, it would reveal not just the truth about what happened in the Missouri Ozarks, but the elaborate lengths to which American communities have gone to protect themselves from uncomfortable truths about their past. The question that haunted serious researchers throughout the 20th century was not just what happened to the Crenshaw family. Mary Crenshaw's manuscript had answered that horrifying question in detail. The deeper mystery was why this particular atrocity had been so thoroughly erased from historical memory, when other Civil War massacres, equally brutal, had been documented and remembered. The Lawrence Massacre of 1863, in which Quantrill's raiders killed over 150 civilians, became a defining moment in Kansas history. The Mountain Meadows Massacre of 1857, where Mormon settlers killed members of a wagon train, generated decades of investigation and legal proceedings. Even smaller-scale atrocities, like the killing of Confederate prisoners at Fort Pillow, found their way into history books and popular memory. But the Crenshaw Massacre, with 17 victims including multiple children, had been systematically excluded from every historical account of Civil War violence in Missouri. This wasn't accidental. It was the result of deliberate choices made by people with the power to shape historical narratives. The answer lay in the unique circumstances surrounding the crime. Unlike other Civil War atrocities, which could be attributed to the chaos of war or the actions of irregular forces, the Crenshaw Massacre was committed by established members of a stable community against their own neighbors. It couldn't be dismissed as the work of outside agitators or enemy combatants. It was a horrifying example of how quickly civilized people could descend into savage violence. More troubling still was the massacre's relationship to Union loyalty. The perpetrators weren't Confederate sympathizers who could be written off as traitors and rebels. They were Union supporters, men who had taken loyalty oaths and served in federal militias. Their crime complicated the simple narrative of loyal Americans versus Confederate insurrectionists that post-war politicians needed to maintain national unity. Federal authorities faced a terrible choice in the aftermath of the massacre. Prosecuting the perpetrators would require acknowledging that Union loyalists had committed atrocities against their neighbors, potentially undermining the moral authority of the federal cause. Ignoring the crime would allow murderers to escape justice, but it would preserve the fiction that all Union supporters had fought honorably for just causes. The decision to suppress the story was made at the highest levels of Missouri's federal administration. Governor Hamilton Gamble, a war Democrat who had struggled to maintain Missouri's loyalty to the Union, saw no benefit in publicizing civilian atrocities committed by Union supporters. Military commanders like General John Schofield were already dealing with criticism of their harsh policies in Missouri. Adding a civilian massacre to their records would only fuel Confederate propaganda. The suppression was also motivated by practical political considerations. Many of the massacre participants had friends and relatives in positions of local authority. County sheriffs, judges, and political leaders throughout southern Missouri were connected by family ties and business relationships to the men who had killed the Crenshaw family. Pursuing justice would have required dismantling entire networks of political and economic power. The Catholic Church's silence was purchased through different means. Church officials were reminded that many of their parishioners were immigrants and Catholics who faced discrimination and suspicion from Protestant communities. Drawing attention to Catholic participation in civilian massacres would only increase anti-immigrant sentiment and religious prejudice. The Church chose to protect its institutional interests rather than demand justice for the victims. Academic historians faced their own constraints. Universities in Missouri depended on state funding and private donations from prominent families, many of whom were descended from Civil War veterans. Research that impugned the reputations of respected pioneer families could result in reduced funding, blocked publications, and damaged careers. The academic reward system encouraged scholars to pursue safer topics that didn't threaten established interests. The legal system provided no avenue for justice once the initial cover-up succeeded. By the time Mary Crenshaw's testimony became available, all the perpetrators were dead, and the statute of limitations had long since expired for any surviving accomplices. Even if prosecution had been possible, the burden of proof would have been enormous after 70 years of deliberate evidence destruction. Perhaps most significantly, the massacre was suppressed because it revealed uncomfortable truths about American frontier justice and community violence. The Crenshaw family had been killed not by outside agitators or military forces, but by their own neighbors. People who attended the same churches, shopped at the same stores, and shared the same basic values. The massacre demonstrated that ordinary Americans, under sufficient stress and provocation, were capable of extraordinary evil. This truth was too dangerous for a nation trying to heal from civil war and build a unified national identity. American mythology required clear distinctions between heroes and villains, between civilization and savagery, between us and them. The Crenshaw massacre collapsed these distinctions, showing that the line between civilized behavior and murderous violence was thinner and more fragile than anyone wanted to acknowledge. The suppression was so successful that by the 1960s, even local historians in Shannon County had no knowledge of the massacre. When the civil rights movement began highlighting other forgotten atrocities, like the Tulsa Race Massacre, researchers looking for similar events in Missouri found nothing about the Crenshaws. The cover-up had become so complete that it had erased itself from memory. But historical truth has a way of surfacing despite the best efforts to bury it. And in the Missouri Ozarks, where oral tradition runs deeper than official records, the story of the Crenshaw family was about to find new voices, willing to speak for the dead. The truth about the Crenshaw massacre finally began to emerge in the 1970s, not through official historical channels, but through the patient work of amateur genealogists and local historians who stumbled upon fragments of the suppressed story. Their discoveries would reveal not just the details of a long-hidden atrocity, but the sophisticated mechanisms that American communities had developed to protect themselves from uncomfortable truths about their past. Dr. Robert Mitchell, a retired English professor from Southeast Missouri State University, was researching his own family history when he encountered references to the massacre in a collection of his great-grandfather's letters. His ancestor had been a Union Army chaplain stationed in Missouri during the Civil War, and his correspondence included cryptic references to civilian troubles and regrettable incidents involving locals. Mitchell's curiosity was piqued by one particular letter dated April 1862, which mentioned the Current River business. and his great-grandfather's unsuccessful attempts to investigate reports of a family wiped out by vigilantes. The chaplain had written to his wife, "I fear we have unleashed forces that will shame us all. Good men have done evil things, and evil things are being called good." This discovery launched Mitchell on a decade-long investigation that would eventually uncover Mary Crenshaw's manuscript in the Darr archives. His 1983 book, Hidden Atrocities of the Missouri Civil War, was the first published account to name the Crenshaw family and detail their fate. But even then, the book was published by a small regional press and received little attention outside academic circles. The real breakthrough came through an unexpected source: genealogy websites and amateur historians working in the emerging field of digital research. In the 1990s, as historical records were digitized and made searchable online, researchers began finding connections that had been invisible when documents were scattered across different archives and institutions. Sandra Williams, a librarian from Springfield, was helping patrons research their Civil War ancestors when she noticed patterns in the disappearances of certain families from Missouri records. Her database searches revealed that multiple families in southern Missouri had vanished from documentation between 1862 and 1863, with no corresponding records of death, relocation, or military service. Williams's research, published online in 1999, identified the Crenshaws as one of 17 families that had experienced systematic record erasure during the Civil War period. Her work suggested that the Missouri Massacre might not have been an isolated incident, but part of a broader pattern of civilian killings that had been systematically suppressed. The Internet age also enabled new forms of collaboration between researchers. Online forums dedicated to Civil War history and genealogy research allowed scholars to share information and compare findings across geographic boundaries. For the first time, researchers working on different aspects of Missouri's Civil War history could easily communicate and coordinate their efforts. One crucial breakthrough came when historical archaeologist Dr. James Patterson decided to investigate the site of the former Crenshaw homestead using ground-penetrating radar and other modern techniques. His 2003 survey revealed clear evidence of structural remains, burned material, and soil disturbances consistent with Mary Crenshaw's account of the massacre and subsequent cover-up. Patterson's archaeological evidence provided physical corroboration for historical accounts that had been dismissed as folklore or fabrication. Soil samples showed elevated levels of ash and charcoal in patterns consistent with multiple buildings being burned simultaneously. Ground-penetrating radar revealed the foundations of structures that matched descriptions in Mary's manuscript. Most significantly, Patterson's team discovered bone fragments and metal artifacts that had survived the fires and burial attempts. While the fragments were too degraded for individual identification, their quantity and distribution pattern suggested that multiple individuals had died at the site, and their remains had been hastily concealed. The archaeological evidence sparked renewed interest in the massacre from professional historians who had previously avoided the topic due to its controversial nature and limited documentation. Dr. Catherine Reynolds of the University of Missouri began incorporating the Crenshaw massacre into her research on civilian casualties during the Civil War, treating it as a case study in how traumatic events are suppressed and forgotten. Reynolds' work revealed that the Crenshaw cover-up had used techniques that would later be employed to suppress other uncomfortable historical events. The systematic destruction of records, the coordination of institutional silence, and the creation of alternative narratives were all methods that appeared in other cases of historical suppression throughout American history. By 2010, the Crenshaw massacre had finally achieved recognition as a legitimate historical event, documented in academic papers, regional history books, and online databases. But this recognition came more than 140 years after the crime, and long after anyone who could have faced justice for it had died. The delay in recognition raises troubling questions about how historical truth is determined and preserved in American society. If a well-documented atrocity involving 17 victims could be hidden for nearly a century and a half, what other events have been similarly erased from memory? How many other communities have successfully suppressed inconvenient truths about their past? Modern historians studying the Crenshaw case have identified it as an early example of what would later be called historical gaslighting, the systematic denial of documented events through institutional coordination and social pressure. The techniques used to suppress the massacre were refined and replicated in later cover-ups, from the Tulsa Race Massacre to various incidents of police violence and corporate malfeasance. The Crenshaw Massacre also demonstrates the limitations of traditional historical methods, which rely heavily on official records and institutional sources. When those sources are compromised or destroyed, entire events can vanish from historical memory, surviving only in family stories, folklore, and archaeological evidence that requires modern technology to interpret. Perhaps most importantly, the eventual exposure of the Crenshaw Massacre reveals the persistent power of truth to surface, despite systematic attempts at suppression. The story survived because it was too horrible to forget completely, too significant to disappear entirely, and too well documented to be indefinitely denied. The dead, it seems, are patient. They can wait decades, even centuries, for justice and recognition. And in the Missouri Ozarks, where the spirits of the Crenshaw family were said to call out from their unmarked graves, that patience has finally been rewarded with the truth. As we stand at the threshold of a new century, the Crenshaw Massacre offers us a chilling lesson about the fragility of historical truth and the ease with which entire communities can conspire to erase inconvenient memories. But it also demonstrates something more hopeful, that truth, like water, finds a way to seep through even the most carefully constructed barriers of silence and denial. The story of the Crenshaw family is not unique in American history. From the Indian removal campaigns of the 1830s to the Japanese internment camps of the 1940s, from the massacres of Chinese immigrants in the 1880s to the lynchings that terrorized African American communities well into the 20th century, our nation's past is littered with atrocities that were systematically hidden, minimized, or reframed to protect those responsible. What makes the Crenshaw case particularly instructive is how completely it was erased and how long that erasure persisted. This wasn't a case of disputed facts or competing interpretations. This was the wholesale elimination of an event from historical memory through coordinated institutional action. It demonstrates that in America, the power to determine what is remembered and what is forgotten has always been concentrated in the hands of those with the MOC, was to lose from uncomfortable truths. The parallel to the Tulsa Race Massacre of 1921 is particularly striking. Both events involve the systematic killing of entire families by their own neighbors. Both were immediately covered up through the destruction of records and the intimidation of survivors. Both were successfully hidden from mainstream historical narratives for decades, surviving only in whispered family stories and fragmentary documentation. But where Tulsa eventually received national attention and official recognition, becoming a symbol of racial injustice and historical suppression, the Crenshaw Massacre remains largely unknown outside academic circles. This difference reveals how even the recovery of historical truth is shaped by contemporary political concerns and social movements. The civil rights movement created a context in which stories of racial violence could be heard and acknowledged, even when they had been hidden for generations. The Tulsa Massacre became part of a larger narrative about American racism and the need for historical honesty about racial oppression. The Crenshaw Massacre, lacking this broader political relevance, remained buried in regional history and genealogical research. This disparity raises difficult questions about which forgotten atrocities deserve recovery and recognition. If historical attention is limited, and if uncovering suppressed events requires significant resources and sustained effort, how do we decide which silenced voices should be heard? Are some injustices more worthy of remembrance than others? The Crenshaw family's fate also illuminates the psychological mechanisms that enable ordinary people to participate in extraordinary evil. The men who killed 17 of their neighbors weren't soldiers following orders or fanatics driven by ideology. They were farmers, shopkeepers, and craftsmen who convinced themselves that murder was necessary to protect their community from traitors and spies. Their ability to live with their crime, to prosper and gain respect in their community while the bones of their victims lay hidden in shallow graves, reveals something disturbing about human nature and social psychology. When entire communities agree to forget certain events, individual conscience becomes a luxury that few can afford. The conspiracy of silence protects not just the perpetrators, but everyone who benefits from forgetting. Perhaps most troubling is the realization that similar cover-ups are likely occurring today. If 23 men could successfully hide a massacre for over a century, what atrocities are being concealed right now through similar combinations of institutional coordination, social pressure, and collective denial? How many contemporary events that seem well documented and widely known will vanish from future historical records? The digital age offers both new opportunities for suppression and new tools for preservation. Information can be deleted or manipulated more easily than ever before, but it can also be copied and distributed in ways that make complete erasure nearly impossible. The same technologies that enable modern cover-ups also provide new methods for documenting and preserving inconvenient truths. The lesson of the Crenshaw Massacre is not that historical truth will inevitably triumph over institutional suppression. It's that the battle between memory and forgetting never ends. Each generation must decide anew what it will remember and what it will allow to be forgotten. Those decisions shape not just our understanding of the past, but our capacity to learn from it and avoid repeating its worst mistakes. In the end, the 17 members of the Crenshaw family wait for us in their unmarked graves, along with countless other victims of America's forgotten atrocities. They remind us that historical truth is not automatic or guaranteed. It's a choice we make every day about what kind of people we want to be and what kind of society we want to build. Their voices, silenced for so long, ask us a simple question. Will we listen to the uncomfortable truths that our past has to teach us, or will we choose the easier path of forgetting, leaving future generations to discover our own carefully buried secrets? The answer we give will determine not just how we remember the past, but how the future will remember us. In the rolling hills of the Missouri Ozarks, where mist still clings to ancient valleys and secrets sleep beneath the soil, the story of the Crenshaw family serves as an eternal reminder that some wounds run too deep for time to heal. Their massacre was not just a crime against 17 innocent people. It was a crime against history itself, against the very idea that truth matters more than convenience. As we've seen, the erasure of the Crenshaw Massacre was not the work of a few guilty individuals trying to escape justice. It was a coordinated effort involving entire institutions, churches, courts, newspapers, schools, and government offices, all working together to ensure that certain events would be forgotten. This wasn't just a cover-up, it was a systematic rewriting of reality itself. But perhaps the most haunting aspect of this story is not what it tells us about the past, but what it reveals about the present. If such a thorough suppression was possible in 1862, in a time of limited communication and primitive record-keeping, what kinds of cover-ups might be possible today, in an age of digital manipulation and centralized information control? The Crenshaw family's fate reminds us that historical truth is never as secure as we imagine. It exists only as long as people are willing to preserve it, defend it, and pass it on to future generations. When communities choose silence over justice, when institutions prioritize reputation over truth, when individuals decide that forgetting is easier than remembering, that's when history dies. The 17 souls who perished on that cold March night in 1862 have finally found their voices. But their story should terrify us as much as it educates us. They remind us that in America, the difference between history and mythology has always been determined by those with the power to control the narrative. They warn us that the ground beneath our feet may be hiding truths that someone, somewhere, has decided we're not ready to know. Their legacy is not just about one forgotten massacre in the Missouri wilderness. It's about the thousands of other stories that remain buried, the countless other victims whose names have been erased, and the uncomfortable reality that our understanding of American history is built on foundations of deliberate forgetting. The Crenshaw family waits for us still, in their unmarked graves, asking the question that every generation must answer. Will we have the courage to face the truth about our past? Or will we choose the comfortable lies that let us sleep peacefully while injustice remains buried in the darkness? The choice, as always, is ours to make. But the dead are watching, and they remember everything, even when the living choose to forget. In the Missouri Ozarks, where the current river still flows past empty meadows and abandoned foundations, the wind sometimes carries sounds that shouldn't exist. Children's laughter, women's voices calling for help, and the ghostly echoes of a history that refuses to stay buried. Some stories, it seems, are too important to die, no matter how deeply they're buried in the soil of forgotten America.